I'm going to take some time, this is Dr. Rosine, to go over this photosynthesis PowerPoint that you were either assigned as part of Mrs. Pfeiffer's biology class or Dr. Rosine's Honors ICV 2 class. So in this photosynthesis PowerPoint, the essential question is obviously how in the world does this process called photosynthesis actually work? And so that is what the note sheet that you have gives you. But I want to go through it and break it down to make sure that you're getting all of the essential parts from this slide presentation. So if we look at the first slide and the first part of what you were asked to put together, if we break down the word photosynthesis, the prefix photo means light. So if we're looking at photography, it's the way that light actually goes through the lenses in something like a camera. So whether it is, a digital one or an SLR or something that's on your phone, it's taking in light and then using the lenses that are in that to produce the image of whatever you are taking your picture of. And then the ending part is synthesis, which means to be able to either put together or make something. So this whole process called photosynthesis means putting something together with light. And what it means to us, if we look at the definition for photosynthesis, you go and look it up and an AI generates it for you, or you're looking at Google or so Microsoft or something like that. What it is going to tell you is that it is a process that plants use, or plant-like organisms use, to be able to take the energy from the sun or solar energy and use it to make chemical energy. And if we're talking about chemical energy, we're talking about the simple sugar or carbohydrate that we know as glucose. Okay, so plants can make their own food. And because they can do that, we call them autotrophs, which basically means that they can make their own energy. But the other question then becomes, if plants can do this and other organisms cannot, how do they get their energy? And so organisms like animals and fungi can't do photosynthesis. So instead of calling them autotrophs, we call them heterotrophs. And the prefix hetero means different, and troph means energy. So we have to have different ways in order to actually get or consume things like fruits, vegetables, our grains, our dairy. We need to consume all of that, which we just kind of generically call our food, in order to get the energy that we need in order to be as effective and efficient as we possibly can. Moving on to the next part, it says, how well do you know your periodic table? Now, students who are in ICV 2 have had chemistry, or students in biology may not have as much experience with it. And so on this particular slide, you get a generic periodic table. And on this one, in really tiny font, it tells you that the chemical symbol C stands for carbon. It is right here. It's element number 6 on our periodic table. The chemical symbol H stands for hydrogen, and hydrogen is the first element on our periodic table, the lightest element in our universe. And then O, which is the 8th element on our periodic table, stands for oxygen. And these 3 elements, along with some of 3 other ones, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, normally kind of form a lot of the elements, or a lot of the basic building blocks that living organisms that you guys are studying this year are made of. All right, so and they are the only elements that show up. So carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are the only ones that show up in our photosynthesis equation. So where did these atoms come from? And you can look at the YouTube video that is linked here to kind of show that. It talks you through it a little bit. But what we're going to look at is when we write an equation, like kind of what goes in and out of photosyn or photosynthesis. What goes into it, we call a reactant, like those things that we're going to put together or react to get something out, and then what we get out is a product. So one way to kind of think about it is if you are making something in the kitchen and you are looking at a recipe for, let's say, chocolate chip cookies. So all the things that go into making your chocolate chip cookies, so your flour, your sugar, your eggs, chocolate chips, all of those kind of things are your reactants. And then the product that you get out is hopefully like that ooey gooey warm chocolate chip cookie. But we're not talking about chocolate chip cookies here. We're talking about photosynthesis. So in this equation, what we're going to put into that, or what we're going to use to react and get that energy from the sun, is that we're going to use 6 molecules of CO2, which is carbon dioxide. We're going to use another 6 molecules of water, and then we're going to use that energy from the sun, and we're going to mix that up in the process called photosynthesis. And what we get out of that is 1, because there's no kind of coefficient, or the coefficient is called a big number that's out in front, and sugar does not have that. Glucose's chemical formula is C6H12O6, and we see that there as a product, as well as 6 molecules of oxygen, right? So the question becomes, how do we take our reactants, or our carbon dioxide and water and sunlight, and use it to make glucose and oxygen? And that is what the whole process of photosynthesis kind of talks us through. All right. So if we look at writing that equation, and it does ask you to write everything that you see below. All right. We are going to take 6 carbon dioxide molecules. We are going to mix it with 6 water molecules. Right. And then we are going to also take some energy in the form of sunlight, right? And here it has this arrow after you put all of these reactants in it. Sometimes when you go to actually look this up, you're going to see the energy or the sunlight on the arrow, like you need this in order to make it go from the reactant side to the product side. That is fine. So either way to write it is completely acceptable. And then on the product side, you're going to get that molecule of glucose or sugar along with your 6 molecules of O2 or oxygen. Okay, so that is your equation for photosynthesis. All right, plant cells have many different parts, okay? And so if we are looking at this leaf cross-section, this part up here is the top, which is called the epidermis, is the upper layer of a leaf. So if we were looking at a leaf, this would be kind of the green part that you would be seeing on the top, but it has no chloroplasts in the epidermis. And then you have all of this that kind of comes in between it, and they don't label a whole lot of this in it, but it does tell you that kind of compared to the chloroplast, even though it shows them in this particular one, this diagram is not the best, but you should have no chloroplast in your epidermis, but they do exist kind of down here below. And so you have all of these chloroplasts that are actually hanging out in this area of the leaf cross-section, which is called the mesophyll. It basically is the middle. This is what we call the upper epidermis. There's no chloroplasts that actually hang out in it. And then this layer that looks very similar to it at the bottom is called the lower epidermis. There should be nothing in there. But in this area between the two, this is the mesophyll. So they show you, here's a mesophyll cell. If you were going to take one and kind of blow it up, all the little green dots that you see in here, okay, are green because of a pigment called chlorophyll, right? And it is like, it looks green to us because we are looking at it. The light from the sun is shining down on it, and it is absorbing every color of the visible spectrum but green. Green is reflected back to us, okay? And that structure that the chlorophyll is in is called a chloroplast, right? And so then we look at all these little tiny chloroplasts that we happen to have in here, and it is broken into all of these different parts. So we have this outer layer, and that is easily called the outer membrane. We have this inner layer, that is called the inner membrane. And then the space that actually exists between the outer membrane and the inner membrane is called the intermembrane space, or the between membrane space. So between the outer and the inner, we get this weird thing that's actually called the intermembrane space. Inside, we get all these little stacks, okay, of what are called thylakoids. They look like stacks of coins. Sometimes people say they look like stacks of pancakes, okay, just stacks of circles, okay, and you can see some of them are lower, some of them are higher, but this thylakoid is where all of the processes of photosynthesis, that conversion from carbon dioxide and water into sugar and oxygen, is going to take place. All right. If we looked at a cross section of it, which is kind of hard to see here, but like if you sliced it open, what they're showing you is that there's a space inside. That space is called the thylakoid space. So it kind of makes sense because it's just the space inside the thylakoid. Okay. And then what's pointing to this white area that's in here, which is all the space that's around your thylakoids, is called the stroma. And then the very last thing that's here is that while each of these little circles, okay, or kind of discs, if you will, are called thylakoids, an entire stack of them all together is called a grana. And sometimes you'll even see it as a granum, where the ending is um. So kind of depending on videos or other note sheets that you might see. So this chloroplast exists within kind of the middle of a leaf, okay? And that is where photosynthesis is going to take place. All right, so what organelle performs photosynthesis? We just talked about that. That is going to be the chloroplast. Okay, if we're looking at a plant cell, you can see a whole bunch of them that are sitting in here. All right, they are only found in producers. Okay, so just basically something that can make its own food, which has got to be a plant or a plant-like organism. And in plants, we are talking about leaves. It is the site of photosynthesis, and like I said, it is because it is containing chlorophyll. And if you kind of want to think about like what a model looks like here, there are some different ways to spell chloroplast. So this is just a different way to look at it. But there is a model where you have the sun. Energy from the sun is going to come down and hit a chloroplast that is in a plant cell. Your carbon dioxide and water are going to go into that chloroplast, and sugar and oxygen are going to come out of it. Okay, so kind of your reactants and your products. So a very simple model or drawing that you could use to represent what is happening in photosynthesis. Okay, the photograph that you actually see here is of an Alodia leaf. Okay, so Alodia is just a common kind of water plant that produces leaves. It is at 400 power, so it is 400 times bigger than what it would actually look like. So this is just, again, there's a YouTube link for you to see it, okay, up close. So the tiny little green structures that we see within the plant cells are all chloroplast, and this is where it happens. So that whole conversion between carbon dioxide and water into sugar and oxygen happens in every single one of these chloroplasts, and then really it happens in every single one of those thylakoids that you happen to see within every single chloroplast. So there are a lot of pieces doing this conversion to help make food for the plant, which in turn can be food that we actually eat if we're looking at things like vegetables, leafy greens, anything basically that can do photosynthesis or this conversion on its own. All right, sorry about that. So what is chlorophyll? Okay, so chlorophyll is a light-absorbing pigment like I talked about. It is found in the chloroplast of a plant cell. We need it for photosynthesis, and it does make plants appear green to us, like I said, because it is absorbing all the other colors in our visible spectrum, except for green. There's also parts of the yellow spectrum and the blue spectrum, but if we look at yellow and blue being able to make green, then there are portions of that spectrum that actually get reflected to us as well. Okay, again, you can see chlorophyll pigment cells within the plant cell in our chloroplasts. All right, so just kind of another visual. So if you're looking at it, sometimes models help us understand what happens to be going on. So we had a really simple kind of hand-drawn one. Here you kind of have a digitally drawn one, which is nice, which it shows you. Here are, here's a rainbow, so we get that visible light spectrum coming from the sun. All right, we also have a tree here as our plant that is doing photosynthesis. So oxygen is being given off because it is a product. Okay, so you kind of see water coming in through the roots, carbon dioxide coming in from the leaves, and then the sugar is actually staying within the leaves of a plant, and in this case the tree, and then the oxygen actually comes out to the atmosphere so that we can breathe it. Okay, so because we actually have plants, at least in part, we get some oxygen to breathe, and then when we breathe out carbon dioxide, a portion of the carbon dioxide that we breathe helps plants to be able to do photosynthesis. All right. Moving on to our next slide, do Venus flytraps do photosynthesis? So we're looking at a particular plant that is a succulent, but it also is a plant that actually eats flies. So sometimes a really good question is, because it actually gets its food in a different way by eating other things, will it still do photosynthesis? And the answer is yes. Venus flytraps still do photosynthesis, okay, but they are a very specialized plant because they will make sugar, they will make glucose that we need, but plants also need other things in order to survive. So they need amino acids because that helps us build proteins, and those kind of act as a building block for living organisms. They need to make vitamins and other cellular components or parts of the cell in order to survive. So in order to do that, at least in part, plants will need additional nutrients that sometimes are actually found in soil. And I know that biology has been growing some seeds in soil and in paper towels. So kind of in some biology classes have been doing it with soil. Others of them have been using paper towels. And I will readily admit from Mrs. Pfeiffer's class that I'm not really quite sure which way that you actually did it. But that is a way to show that you can get some additional nutrients for things. Venus flytraps live in bogs, and so their soil is particularly acidic. It's a little bit different than some of our other plants. And because the soil is so acidic, the minerals and nutrients that are in that soil are very scarce. They're not very plentiful, and there's not a lot of them. So most plants can't survive in this environment because they can't make what they need in order to grow. But the Venus flytrap has involved this kind of unique ability to thrive in this area, which we call an ecological either niche or niche. And they find this alternative means by getting key nutrients like nitrogen in order to help them. Living creatures like the insects that they can trap inside a portion of the plant also provide them with a good source of nutrients that are missing from the soil. And they also can get sugar from the insects, like that they've actually been, like if an insect goes and gets nectar from some other plant, it also gets trapped in there, then they can get additional carbohydrates from that. And again, there is a YouTube link where you can go and watch and learn a little bit more about Venus flytraps and kind of the unique environment that they have, but still they are doing photosynthesis. All right, so photosynthesis overview. If we are looking at it, let me put these up here and we'll kind of talk through it. All right, photosynthesis comes in two parts. So sometimes we actually call it the light and the dark reactions that they have. So, and people sometimes kind of actually get this misconception that the light dependent reaction only happens in the light and the dark reaction only happens in the dark. Okay. Really, a better way to look at it is exactly what's sitting here on this slide, is that the light dependent reactions are dependent on having some sort of light source. So in nature, that is normally the sun, but in plants that we might have around our house, it could be the sun, but it could also just be lights that you have in your house, or grow lights if you happen to have access to those. Whereas the light independent reaction will happen regardless of whether or not you have light. Okay, so you don't need light in order to run it. All right, the light dependent reactions are called photosystems. Okay, so they are systems that require light in order to run, and they will take place in the thylakoid membrane. So that kind of, the area in the thylakoid, okay, that is inside the chloroplast, okay, and the thylakoid membrane is, at least in part, is going to produce oxygen as a byproduct, and that is what goes out to the atmosphere. You can kind of see it hanging out over here on the left-hand side, and that goes into the atmosphere. So at least in part, that is something that other living organisms that are not plants and are animals or fungus have the ability to take in to help them breathe. All right. And the light independent reactions, those ones that can run with or without light, are called the Calvin cycle. All right. And the Calvin cycle takes place outside the thylakoid, so in a place called the stroma. And the Calvin cycle basically was named after a guy by the name of Melvin Calvin, and he was a lord. So sometimes you will see it called the Lord Kelvin cycle. You might also see it as what we call the citric acid cycle, because it will produce, it produces sugar. Okay. And in nature, we see a lot of that sugar sometimes in the fruits that we eat. Okay. So Calvin cycle, citric acid cycle should be good. So here we're going to put some carbon dioxide into that, and we are going to get sugar out. Okay. There's just another model to be able to do that. So the way that this actually breaks down is that if we're looking at the chloroplasts that are inside the plant cell, right, light from the sun is going to come in and is going to hit is going to hit our thylakoids in the light reactions in the photosystems. Right, we are going to have some water come into our chloroplasts, right, and interact in our thylakoids through a bunch of different reactions. When that water comes in, it is going to split the water. The light from the sun splits water, and we get some hydrogen, and we also get some oxygen that ends up leaving. So we talked about that earlier, how oxygen leaves, all right? And it can be part of the air that we breathe. So sometimes people actually think that this O2 comes from CO2, but it definitely doesn't. A part of the oxygen that we breathe actually comes from water. So it's kind of neat to actually think that the same water that we drink can, with help in photosynthesis in a plant, give us oxygen that we have access to breathe. Now, in addition to that, these light reactions also produce some energy carrying molecules. Okay, and an energy carrying molecule can be something that is produced in the mitochondria. It can also be produced in the chloroplast. It's just that we call the mitochondria the powerhouse of the cell because it can produce a lot more than what a chloroplast can. So in the light reactions, we are going to take this energy producing molecule called ADP. It stands for adenosine diphosphate. It just means that it has two phosphate groups attached to it. It's a really big word. We're going to add another phosphate group to it. That's what this P is. And we're going to put that into the thylakoids, and we are going to get some energy in the form of adenosine triphosphate out. So if we take two phosphate groups here, add another one, so 2 plus 1 would give us 3 phosphate groups that we have. And then there is another kind of lesser known, all right, energy molecule. Doesn't carry as much energy to it. It is known as NADP+. It's got a really long name, okay? And it is missing, like we have a plus here. What it means is that it's missing something else. It needs something to bond with it. And so what ends up happening in the thylakoid is we're going to take some of these H's that we are not using from water, and we are going to help it bond with NADP+, and it ends up becoming NADPH, okay? And then the energy that we use from this, and that's basically what happens in the light reactions. And then now that we have this energy from ATP and NADPH, even though it's only a little, right, we are going to take it out of the thylakoid, put it into the stroma so that we can allow the Calvin cycle to happen. And we're going to take carbon dioxide, right, from the atmosphere. It is going to move into the chloroplast for these light independent reactions, and we are going to use energy from these two molecules as well as our carbon dioxide and some other things that happen to be in the chloroplast, and we are going to use all of that to make sugar. When we use it in the Calvin cycle, okay, the ATP is going to break apart back into ADP plus phosphate. And so there's a kind of a cycle within the cycle, or a feedback loop, excuse me. And that kind of goes back and forth, okay, to kind of putting ATP together. The Calvin cycle breaks it apart. It goes back to the light reactions. It puts it together and generates more. And so you have this kind of making and breaking cycle that not only happens with ADP plus P to get ADP, but you also get this making and breaking of NADP plus and NADPH, because you're going to kind of drop this off. You're going to drop that hydrogen off, and it kind of loses one. And so it's like, oh, I have to go and get another one. So it goes back to the light reactions, picks up another H. The Calvin cycle needs the hydrogen, so you have to go and drop it off. So it's kind of like a taxi service that exists back and forth between that. And you often will hear this analogy that exists between these two processes. So you've got kind of this one process that's happening that requires light from the sun or another light source. The Calvin cycle, which is the light independent one, it will run whether or not you have light or not. And then you also have kind of these two energy reactions that are continuously happening between these two cycles in an overview. All right, parts of the plant. Okay, so where do the reactants kind of come from? All right, water is absorbed by the roots of the soil. Okay, and we're going to move it through the roots from the soil up through what's actually called the central vein. Okay, so if you look at a leaf, or you happen to, like, as they're falling on the ground all over right now, there's a stem in it. That stem has a hole that's actually in the middle of it, or it looks like it's a hole. It's actually the central vein, and that is how the water will move up into the chloroplasts that are in the leaves. Carbon dioxide is actually acquired from the air because of gas exchange, and then on the underneath side of the leaf, there are these little tiny holes that we call pores on them, and there's a picture right here for it. When they are closed and gas exchange is not happening, this structure that is called a stomata is closed. So, and it looks like this. There's a little line when it's closed, and then when the plant cell or the leaf needs to be able to take in oxygen or let out carbon dioxide, or the reverse, it will open, and this little opening that you get on the underneath side of a plant is called a stomata. Okay, and then on either side, these cells that are here are called guard cells. So it's like they're guarding the opening to it. Okay, and then when you can come in, it opens up, and when you can't come in, it closes. So it's kind of like the doors to stores that we might actually go and shop in. If they're open 24 hours, you can kind of get in whenever you want. But if they're not, if they only have certain hours of operation, then the doors close when you can't get in, kind of like school. Okay, so like in the middle of the night, we don't have school. But from 7:15 to, kind of 2:15, we have school, and then the doors would actually be open for a period of time to be able to let us go in. That opening, if you were in a plant, would be called the stomata. Okay, so that's kind of some of the parts of the plant that we need in order to get it started. Okay, and then when the chloroplast actually produces oxygen from water as a waste product, like the plant is not going to use it, then it actually leaves through the stomata. So it can go back to the atmosphere so that we might breathe it, or oxygen can do some other things that photosynthesis doesn't really worry about. Okay, so again, the overview of photosynthesis. Here you kind of have a real life picture of a tree, but still it's just a different way to model the entire thing that we've been saying kind of all the way along. So you have an arrow kind of saying, here's the sunlight that's coming in from that. You have oxygen that is going to leave all your leaves. Okay, so it really is leaves, oxygen is leaving leaves. Okay, to go into the atmosphere. You have carbon dioxide that is coming in from the atmosphere to the chloroplast in the leaves, and you are making sugar from that. And you have water that is coming in through the roots to allow that to happen. Okay. The reaction outcomes, yikes, there we go. Okay, so reaction outcomes and locations. The light reaction converts light energy. So it's taking the energy from the sun or light and is converting it into chemical energy, and it is making those two energy carriers. This is an electron carrier. Okay, so it is carrying electrons because it's making and breaking bonds for these two energy carriers, ATP and NADPH. All right. It occurs in the thylakoid membranes, or these stacks that we're actually talking about within the thylakoid. And again, just as a reminder, okay, each individual one of these little discs is called a thylakoid. The entire stack is called a grana. All right. We see water coming in and oxygen coming out. Okay. They're reminding you here, you've got your outer membrane and your inner membrane. Those are just parts of the chloroplast to remind you where it is happening. All right. And then we've got the Calvin cycle, okay, occurring in the stroma. So here, okay, this is CO2 going in. And here they have a molecule, and it says it's Ga3P. That is half a sugar. Okay, so when this happens, depending on how you look at the Calvin cycle and how it happens to be structured, okay, some videos are going to say you only have to go around the Calvin cycle once to make a sugar. Others of them are going to say you have to go around it twice. This particular diagram is just saying you have to make it go around twice, and this Ga3P is half a sugar, and then you would get the other half of the sugar when you went around it twice, and then they join together to make glucose. Okay, so don't let this part be something that's actually confusing. And then here, it's just saying that we have ADP and a phosphate group. Okay, so this is just one phosphate group. That P sub I is the same as the phosphate group that you saw in the other one. It's just another way to write it. Plus NADP plus is going into the thylakoid. Okay, and then when the light reactions happen or the photosynthesis reactions are going to happen, it's the ADP plus the P is going to make ATP, and then NADP plus some hydrogens that we're going to use from water are going to make NADPH. They're going to go over to the Kelvin cycle to help make the sugar that we get using carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And then, okay, these are going to get broken apart. So then they have to go back to the light reactions to be able to be put together again. So the light reactions put them together. The Kelvin cycle kind of tears them apart. Okay, so it's just a making and breaking that goes back and forth. 3 things that affect how well photosynthesis can actually happen. Number 1 is the intensity of the light that you get. Okay, so it's definitely one of the most important. As the light intensity increases, or you actually happen to have more light, then the rate of photosynthesis is going to initially increase, and then it is going to level off, okay? Because there's only so much effectiveness and efficiency that photosynthesis can have. And so the graph would look like this. Here's the rate of photosynthesis, and this is light intensity. So you see a very quick increase in the rate of photosynthesis that happens. And then when it kind of gets to its peak performance, it levels off into what we actually call a plateau. Right? The light intensity is definitely one of the most important things that's going to affect photosynthesis. Okay, another thing that's going to affect it is the carbon dioxide levels that exist around the plant. All right, so if you increase the level of carbon dioxide that you happen to have available to your plant, it is going to stimulate photosynthesis until the rate reaches a plateau. All right, so, but the more carbon dioxide that you can actually get, then the more glucose that you can actually get. Okay, so your carbon dioxide graph is very similar to your light intensity graph. You're going to get this too, but basically, just like with light, the more light you have, the more glucose you can actually get. Okay, and the faster and the more effective photosynthesis is going to be. Same thing with carbon dioxide. If the more carbon dioxide, the more glucose you have, the lower the amount of carbon dioxide you have available around the plant, the lower the amount of glucose is that you are going to make. And then, right, the last thing that can actually affect photosynthesis is the temperature. All right, so the rate of photosynthesis increases as the temperature increases. Okay, it peaks at certain temperatures, or it kind of will plateau and peak at certain temperatures, and then it begins to decrease when the temperature is further increased. So you get to this point just like this graph shows, and it was also on the last slide beforehand, almost kind of as a foreshadowing to it, is that you get, here's the temperature and then the rate of photosynthesis. So you get this nice steady increase. So as you're raising your temperature, the rate at which your photosynthesis process is going to happen increases. You get up to this peak, and then if you make your temperature go too high, photosynthesis is going to start to become less and less effective. All right. Then, okay, there are some video clips as to why leaves actually change color, okay, and there are YouTube video links that are there. There are pigments that are in leaves, okay, chlorophyll being one of the most prevalent ones, and there are factors that actually affect how long chlorophyll will actually stick around. Okay, and one of those factors, it's not the only one, is something that's actually called polarity. All right, and people who have had chemistry can understand polarity maybe a little bit more. It makes a little bit more sense sometimes than if you haven't had it. But basically what it is chlorophyll just has this really prevalent pigment. But then when temperature starts to affect it in a certain way, it starts to actually break down. And then once it starts to break down, there are other pigments that are present in leaves that start to become more and more visible to us, because when the green that is being reflected to us starts to break down, then there are other portions of the visible spectrum that start to be reflected rather than absorbed. And we see those as the brilliant reds and orange and yellows that will normally permeate our trees and our bushes in the fall. But chlorophyll is there for the longest period of time, which is why during most of our season we happen to see green leaves, right? And then when all the pigments kind of actually leave, then we are left with that very characteristic brown color that our leaves tend to take on. Right? So we get these other pigments that we see either as an anthocyanin, which can be your red and purples, and something that's called a carotenoid that is your orange and yellows. Okay, and so these slides kind of break that down for you. You can't see it because of the chlorophyll. Green starts to break down, other pigments show up. Okay, so kind of a summary and review come from this YouTube video that happened to be in the link, and then 3 things that you happen to learn from the video. Okay, and then there are like some fun songs to actually be able to look at for this. So answering that essential question all the way back, okay, at the beginning. All right, so if we go all the way back through all this information that we have covered, and it has been a lot, okay, so feel free to kind of take this in chunks, all right, but all the way back to the beginning, okay, how does photosynthesis work? All right, so thank you so much for your attention to this particular slideshow that we've actually had. Again, being able to go through all of this different information that you have learned throughout these slides and looked at it as you were filling in your note sheet, all right, but being able to actually answer that essential question. Thanks so much for tuning in.